Hey, Rosemary, we left Joel out in the cold somewhere. He was supposed to be traveling from northern Wisconsin to Texas, but we can't seem to find him anywhere. My guess he may be back in the snow. So it's just us two this week, which is super awesome because we rarely get to do a show, just the two of us anymore. So what do you have on the list this week?
Well, we've got the recent auctions for offshore wind in California. So that's going to be floating offshore wind. And then we have a microwave drilling technique to make deeper holes for geothermal power.
Then we have some discussion about whales off the coast of Massachusetts and how wind turbines can affect the zooplankton. And then we had a thunder snow apocalypse off of Lake Ontario recently, and researchers up there have instrumented that whole area and have recorded lightning strikes that happened to wind turbines. So there's going to be a lot of good information coming out of there. And then I have an interview with Phil Totaro of Intelstor when we talk about PPAs of onshore wind and the operational risks involved on some really low PPA prices that some of these operators have in place. So it's a really interesting episode. Stay tuned. I'm Alan Hall, president of WeatherGuard Lightning Tech, and I'm here with Australian renewables guru Rosemary Barnes. Joel Saxum is out in the field doing some good work, and we'll be back next week. And this is the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast. Rosemary, we just finished the California auction for all those offshore plots. There were actually 5 plots that were up for bid. They had about a little over 40 different companies that were able to bid. They got their little process to get vetted. So there's like 43 of them that were vetted to go. And they were auctioning off about 370,000 acres, sort of in central and northern California. The plot up north is really close to Oregon, actually, so it's pretty far north. And they think they're going to generate 4.6 gigawatts off these sites, so that's a lot of power. It's like 1.5 million homes they're going to power. Well, based on predictions, I think they were thinking it was going to go well over $1 billion in bids, but it didn't get there. It went to $757 million, which is roughly $2,000 an acre. And the bite auction on the East Coast was about $4 billion, and that turned out to be about $8,000 an acre. So the waters off the coast of California were about a quarter the price of the ones off the East Coast, which I guess sort of makes sense just because it's floating California versus fixed bottom New York. So that was an interesting bidding process, Rosemary. It went on for a day and a half, almost 2 days before they finally settled out. There were only about 7 to 8 initial bidders out of the 43, and that whittled down to 5 at the end. So it didn't. There weren't a lot of bidders. In the bidding rounds, Joel and I were going back and forth on Slack about it. The bidding went like, $16 million this round, $32 million next round. So it was making these sort of massive jumps in millions of dollars until they got to, they're roughly 100 million, a little over 100 million a plot. So that's a good bit of money. I don't know what happens down in Australia. Do you do a similar thing down there? Because I know Europe hates that bid for plots like this.
We're not ready for that yet in Australia, and I don't know how it's going to happen. Probably it hasn't been decided how it's going to happen. We're in this weird kind of process where, the offshore wind in Australia, it's been pushed by companies, that have started, trying to develop a project there. And so, there's individual companies, and one in particular, Star of the South, they have done a ton of work to try and bring the government, to the place they need to be able to, get permits to, start a wind farm, but they don't have permission to use that area. So it would be pretty strange if after all this work that they have done, assessing the resource and, teaching the government what they need to do or set in place to be able to, get their environmental and everything else assessments underway. it would be pretty funny if at the end of that they just went to an open auction and they lost. That would be quite strange. So I would be a bit surprised if that's how it happens here, but I guess there needs to be some sort of process.
Yeah, I'm not sure the American process is the best process. It did seem to take quite a while, and it didn't have a lot of activity.
Yeah, and I think when we all watched the one on the East Coast auction, it seemed like they paid too much. And I think with everything that has been coming out about, we've been following advances in the wake persistence, how far the wake of an upstream wind farm will affect a downstream one. And I don't know, I do tend to think that some of the winners of those auctions might regret the amount that they paid. So I think, so California was a quarter the price. Like you say, it takes into account the fact that you got to put floating offshore wind there, which is a very new technology, and add to that the fact that probably the East Coast one was overpaid, and I think that explains the difference. I bet if they did another one over in a similar area to the ones around New York, that you would see lower prices this time too. I mean, also the economic outlook is just a lot different now than it was a year or two ago. So that would also have an effect.
A year ago. Well, the some of the winners here of the offshore California auction, it was RWE, Equinor, Invenergy, and then there's two kind of conglomerates here, California North Floating, which is I think EDP Renewables and Engie, I think were the two there. I have to look that one back up again. Everybody can just Google it. And the other one was Central California Offshore Wind LLC. So there are two LLCs involved, which just was interesting. Joel and I were going back and forth just to figure out who everybody was and where they were from. There was not an American company in the bidding, weirdly enough. Invenergy is based in Chicago, but it's owned by a Canadian company, but mostly owned by a Canadian company up in Quebec, it sounded like. So there wasn't a huge American investor there, which I guess makes sense because all the knowledge about offshore is not in America, that's for sure. So it makes sense for companies that know what they're doing to bid on these projects. And maybe that's why it ended up the way that it did, because the expert companies were the ones that were able to maybe secure contracts with OEMs on terms of making turbines. There seems like your supply chain would be a really big driver here, whether you're going to bid or not. If you could somehow talk to a GE, talk to a Vestas, talk to a Siemens Gamesa and say, hey, we're going to bid on this project. Are you in? I have a hard time thinking Siemens Gamesa or GE is going to sign up for 20 different companies to say, yeah, we're in. I think they're going to have a subset. Same thing for cables, same thing for the floating pylons, whatever they're going to do. Don't you think that's probably part of the issue, is how it limited the number of bidders, just supply chain?
Yeah, I think supply chain, but also just the risk. There's only 3, maybe 4 now floating offshore wind farms that exist in the world. And I think 3/4 of those are Equinor's. Right. Equinor has a partial stake at least. So no surprise to see them on there. And then everybody else, they've got to learn through this project. So it's hard to pay a lot for the right to, just try something out and see if it's going to work. So on the one hand, there's nothing like brand new being used in these. You've got existing wind turbines. You've got a lot of knowledge of floating platforms from oil and gas, and, the engineering involved is fairly straightforward. So whilst it's never been done before, you would be pretty confident that you could, foresee most of the problems that you'd have and, design around them. But on the other hand, you always attempt to, think through every problem that might happen and make a good design first time, but it doesn't work out that way. It is different enough that, there's going to be surprises in yeah, maybe it's not such a big issue to make a wind turbine that will, stay upright, but will it generate the power that's expected? Just small differences in angle. If it's bobbing around, that could have a bigger than expected effect on the power production, but also on the life of the components if the loads are very different to the way that they have been designed and operated in the past, these turbines. So I think there is a fair amount of uncertainty there, and I guess people are trying to limit the size of their losses. It's a huge potential industry in the future, but how much advantage is there for being the early leader? I'm not sure, because mostly you should just be able to see what works for other people and copy it, because you're not going to be able to patent the use of a platform or a structure that was used for decades in offshore oil and gas. You're not going to, just because you're using it for a wind turbine, you won't be able to patent that, and nobody else can do it. So you can just take a look at all of Ecuador's floating offshore wind farms and see what direction they're going, and just be like, okay, well, we don't need to make the first three things that didn't really work for them. We'll just go with the fourth one that's providing, reliable base for the turbines. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it goes. It will be surely at least another decade before this kind of technology is competing on its own, except for in very specific places. And California is one of those places that has specific circumstances, like they really, really want their renewables and this resource. The winds are higher in the afternoon, and that's when people are using electricity. So, it's in contrast to solar, which peaks in the middle of the day. And it's not very well aligned with when people are using it. So yes, solar is much, 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 much cheaper than floating offshore wind. But on the other hand, electricity prices are usually close to zero or even negative in places where there's a lot of solar in the grid on a sunny day. So I think that you'll get much higher value from the floating offshore wind farms. So remains to be seen how profitable that will be overall. Lots of pros, lots of cons. Very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think California hasn't made it easy for the developers. There's some, Phil Totaro had posted a couple of items on LinkedIn, and I was watching, and he was discussing some unknowns about where the transmission cables are going to hit shore that hasn't been really well defined yet, and how it's going to integrate with the California grid, which it hasn't been defined yet, and the utility operator in California is not making any motions to buy the energy yet. There's a lot of unknowns there. Those can be very expensive. And we were just talking also before the show about the names of some of these companies that were bidding. California North Floating and Central California Offshore Wind. They defined that what they were going to bid on in the name of the company. So when you saw that company bid, you know they were going to bid on the north part or the central part of those auctions. So it just seems weird, right? I mean, do you show your hand like that at an auction? Is that the best way to do that? Because it seems like a really bad James Bond episode where, James Bond always goes to an auction. He's going to buy a Fabergé egg or something, and he's going to take it away from the villain. And that always goes sideways because he declares what he's going to do while he walks into the room. And it's always been my tendency, like, if I go into an auction, not to tell anybody what I'm bidding on. They seem to take the big, bold move and to name their companies like James Bond does when he walks into a room. He just says, I'm going to bid on that, and I'm going to walk out of here with that. I guess it's a move. It worked.
They succeeded. Obviously, they scared off anybody else.
They named what they're going to bid for. Yeah. It's just sort of a funny thing. Like, oh, the name is what they purchased. Well, I guess so. Yeah. Sure. Why not?
I did think it was interesting that they haven't yet got the transmission in place that they need to connect to these wind farms, because that's the difference with the projects that I'm hearing about in Australia. Basically, the very first thing that they do is find a coal power plant, a huge coal power plant that's going to retire soon. I mean, they're all going to retire soon. That's near the coast where the is a good offshore wind resource nearby. And so that means that they don't have to do much other than get, like from the beach to the power plant, where there's already really, really huge, good, big transmission in place. So yeah, what a huge uncertainty for the people that have, put up millions of, hundreds of millions of dollars for a resource that they don't know how, if they don't know whether they're going to have to pay for that transmission themselves or not. So, I mean, that would massively affect the value, right? And and they don't know who's going to, if they're going to have to, find customers, or if that's going to be, assisted by the government. So, yeah, really unusual to not have those big details sorted before the auction, in my opinion. But I guess everyone's just really keen to get in there.
Well, I guess it does change the price, right? That's what happened. It changed the value of the asset. Looks like it's significantly.
Ping Monitor is a continuous blade monitoring system which allows wind farm operators to stay ahead of maintenance. Wind techs can often hear damaged blades from the ground, but they can't continuously monitor all the turbines. They also can't calculate how bad the damage is or how fast it's propagating based on sound, but Ping can. Ping's acoustic system is being used on over 600 turbines worldwide. It allows operators to discover damage before it gets expensive and prioritize maintenance needs across their fleet, and it pays for itself the first time it identifies serious damage or saves you from doing an unnecessary visual inspection. Stop flying blind out there. Get Ping's ears on your turbines. Learn more at pingmonitor.co.
Rosemary, in my hour of free time this week, and I literally had an hour of free time this week. It's just, I don't know why everything's so crazy in December. This December is nuts. Well, I didn't have a baby. You had a baby. So I can't really complain. My time is probably a little more free than yours at the moment. But I was watching there was a national offshore wind R&D conference that was held in Northeastern University, which is in Boston. And they had a bunch of researchers come in and explain some of the projects they're working on. And one of them was talking about whales. And there's a certain kind of whale that runs along the East Coast. It's called the right whale. And the right whale was fished heavily in the 1800s because it produced or yields a lot of oil. So a lot of the oil burning light candles or oil lamps that they had on the East Coast were burning whale oil. Well, the right whale was named a right whale because when you killed it, it floated, so you could get to the oil before it sunk. So they were heavily hunted, and there's about 350 of these whales left. And because maybe I'm wrong here, but I think my animal knowledge goes into this. The bigger the animal, the longer the sort of the gestation time to have calves is. So it takes a long time to rebuild that population base, kind of like elephants, right? Versus rabbits. There's your difference. So it takes a long time to build that population back up, and they've been having like 3 to 8 calves born a year. So it's not really growing that fast. So they're super concerned about these right whales, and the right whales run up along the coastline and eat all the shrimp and things that are floating around in there. Okay. So there's concern now with offshore wind turbines because, as we've been talking about more recently, the wakes off the wind turbines not only disturb the air, but they disturb the water behind it. And there's concern, and there's been some research that when the water gets churned by these wakes, that it may change the animal life or the zoology in the water. So the people that are assigned to watch the fish and the mammals in the waters are starting to be concerned about this, and they're putting buffer zones in. In fact, they're talking about a 20-kilometer buffer zone off the coast of Massachusetts to the edge of the wind turbines, and trying to keep that a whale zone almost. And this is the first that I've heard of it. I know there's been concerns about whales and other sea life around that area, but this is the first time I had someone explain what the issue was. And we don't know that much about what wind turbines do to the water behind the wind turbines yet, do we?
No, I haven't. I don't know. I'm not a marine biologist though. So It is interesting, and definitely, it sounds plausible that that would be a problem and should be studied. I'm just always surprised why it's always in the US where these issues get raised when Europe has had, offshore wind for so long. And I know that their waters are more shallow. They likely don't have this specific whale there. They do have other whales and other marine life, obviously. But Europe does tend to have very strict environmental regulations, and I know that if you want to put in a wind farm in Europe, then you're going to need like a large dining table size of documentation to go along with it. So it just surprises me that no European ever thought to look at this problem. And the articles, I don't know, maybe it's an American thing, but they never address that really obvious issue in my mind. Like, has this been studied in Europe? They never say if it has or hasn't. So I guess I could find that out for myself with a few minutes of research, but I didn't do it. I didn't do that few minutes. So I don't know if that's been studied before, but I would assume that it could be studied pretty promptly, within a few years. It's going to take a decade or two for offshore wind to really get up to full speed. So there's time to do some good studies and find out to what extent this is a problem before moving ahead. And then I'm sure that we'll be able to find solutions if it does turn out to be a big problem. You make sure you map where the whales go and make some exclusion zones so that they're undisturbed in some of their favorite places, I would assume. Again, I'm not a marine biologist, but it just seems like the answer is to study it and see if it's an issue, and if it is, come up with controls so that we don't end up making any species go extinct or struggle unnecessarily.
Yeah, and I was a little shocked by it too. It seems like the research is being done in Europe, in the North Sea mostly, and the researchers were over, I think, in Germany, that really kicked this thing off, and the Americans are just taking that research and expanding upon it, it sounds like. But it also the discussion evolved into installations of wind turbines in the water that they were concerned about the acoustics. Obviously, you're driving these pilings into the ocean floor, that there's whales in that general area, and they have track whales in that area. They're actually sensing the clicking or the noises that the whales make, so they can get a general sense as to where the whales travel. That they were concerned that there are certain parts of the year where you probably didn't want to put in wind turbines in the water just because of the density of whales in that region. You didn't want to upset them or change their habit very much. And it looked like the whales were active in the wintertime, that they go south in the summertime, and that's when the great white sharks head up our way. So or the whales are replaced by gigantic sharks. That they're just trying to keep that sort of flow of these large sea creatures going and not to alter that at all. I don't know how you're going to manage that, because I don't think we know enough about it. Maybe I'm wrong. It just seems like it's a question that's been posed. They're trying to create these buffer zones. They don't know if the buffer zones are real or not yet. It's a huge question mark. And we go back to the California auction, and there's a lot of unknowns there. This is a huge unknown. There's 350 of these whales around. You don't want to be responsible for ending that population because you put some wind turbines in the water, right?
No.
I'm not sure. Does this get answered before you start putting wind turbines in? I don't know if it does.
I think it's okay to put some wind turbines in before you've got a definitive answer, and that will be part of the way that you study. If it has an effect, it'll be really hard to know for sure before you put anything in there. But I think, what you've got to do is set up some research ASAP. And, so California's got an extra $757 million in their pocket compared to a couple of days ago. So, I bet that could buy quite a lot of whale research. Yeah. And then start small and make sure that you make it a condition of the project development that they have to include some monitoring activities. Of course, they're gonna start out small anyway. No one's gonna put in a whole gigawatt wind farm when they have never made it a floating offshore wind farm before, or even for fixed bottom. Every developer's going to start out small. There's also some wind farms, offshore wind farms already in the world, lots in Europe. You could monitor, answer a lot of questions from monitoring there. You could at least, find out the extent of that of, you know, how deep water gets churned up and how much, and you know, what the effect is on if there's more or less life in the water than in an area without a wind farm. I think that there's a lot that they can do, and I bet that the money that would take to answer these questions is small compared to the size of the industry. I just think, yes, it's good that this question has been raised and we should answer it. I'll be really surprised if the answer turns out to be something that is incompatible with developing offshore wind. I think it will probably help us to figure out how it should be done and where they should be located, and how many exclusion zones should be set up. I think that they should definitely do that. I definitely wouldn't want to see any whale go extinct because of offshore wind.
Right, and I didn't realize at the time that how much research had actually gone into the whales and to the zooplankton that's running around off the coast of Massachusetts and New York. So I started digging around a little bit deeper to see if other animal studies have been done onshore. And it turns out there's one real close to us here in Massachusetts, actually just a couple of miles away from here, up in Vermont, because we're right on the border. And there was a series of wind turbines installed up there 6-ish years ago. And they have been doing a study on black bears up there of does the wind turbines change the behavior of black bears as they kind of traipse through the woods over there. And they've been doing that study for almost 10 years, a little over 10 years. And they're just going to be able to publish some results in 2024. So I started noodling that a minute, like, wait a minute. Okay, so we have onshore creatures that we see in the neighborhoods all the time, and we can see them wandering through the woods all the time. Those are pretty easy to track. Bears aren't moving very far, typically, and they tag them in the wintertime when they're sleeping, the poor bears. They wake them up and tag them, put a little collar on them, look like a bow tie sort of thing, and then they wander around, and they beep, and they find out where they go. But whales are a lot harder to track.
You need a really big collar.
Put a collar on a whale, I don't think. Right. It just is a lot more expensive, right? Because the whales travel thousands of miles, where a bear is probably in the hundreds of miles. So it just seems like a much bigger task to go do.
Lightning is an act of God, but lightning damage is not. Actually, it's very predictable and very preventable. Strike Tape is a lightning protection system upgrade for wind turbines made by WeatherGuard. It dramatically improves the effectiveness of the factory LPS, so you can stop worrying about lightning damage. Visit weatherguardwind.com to learn more, read a case study, and schedule a call today.
Rosemary, if you've watched enough James Bond movies, you know that drilling a hole to the center of the earth is typically left up to the villains that are trying to hold humanity hostage for $1 billion. But evidently at MIT, they've thought this is a good idea because there's a company called Quaise Energy that's looking to do the same thing. So back at MIT, this is a couple of years ago, they were playing around with millimeter wave radar to determine if they could drill with a radar. It turns out you can. Now they initially drilled a 2-inch deep hole, 2 inches wide, and a piece of bustle. They're using millimeter wave energy to bore into the earth, and they've done it in the laboratory, so they can do it. They haven't done anything massive scale yet, but they're proposing to do this. So the goal is that if they could drill deep into the Earth's core, God, it's like an Austin Powers episode, into the liquid magma of the Earth's core, they could get the heat out. And there's a lot of heat in the center of the Earth. So they could basically create a thermal generator. This is essentially what they're talking about. Now, the question comes in, one, they have barely even they haven't dug any serious hole, and they don't really have an ability to create a huge millimeter wave energy system to do it. And the furthest that anybody has ever mechanically drilled down into the earth is about 7 miles. And of course, that happened in Russia. Why wouldn't it happen there, right? So Rosemary, does it make sense to go after this? It seems like this Quaise Energy, which is based outside Boston, is raising money. They seem to be active in a lot of fronts. Is this technology hold a future, or is it just too damn dangerous? Because I'm kind of in the too damn dangerous camp at the minute.
Yeah, maybe. And I mean, what did they manage? 10 centimeters so far. So I don't think that like next year or the year after we're going to be seeing 50-kilometer deep drilling with this technology. I assume that it will be much longer than that, and I hope that it will be, so that you can figure out what's going on. Because I know that some other forms of drilling for geothermal have been definitely linked to earthquakes that have caused a lot of damage. So, you know, it is high stakes. But on the other hand, I mean, geothermal is it's really tempting prospect because it is, it's very similar to nuclear in the way, you know, the kind of electricity that you get out of it. It's just like really, really, really constant and no emissions. And in the case of geothermal, you don't have any toxic waste or any, you know, problem with people not wanting to live nearby unless, of course, they're worried about earthquakes, in which case you probably get the same thing. And I know that a lot of countries that really struggle to find enough renewable resources to, you know, have a zero emissions economy in the future, they do have good geothermal resources. Like Japan springs to mind. I've been in the onsens there. There's plenty of natural geothermal activity there. So you wouldn't even need this drilling technique in Japan because it's there's heat quite close to the surface there.
Active volcanoes.
Yeah. I think Indonesia is another one that, it's difficult for them to just get enough wind and solar. And a lot of Asia has that problem. It's just too densely populated to be able to get all the wind and solar, enough wind and solar to power the whole country. Yeah, so it makes sense. I mean, I have been interested for a while in why Japan has been, you know, so pro hydrogen. Why not alternatives? And to me, geothermal is the obvious one for Japan because, you know, they've got the resource there. And I've heard that the reason why Japan isn't keen on geothermal is because the good resources are in their national parks, and they're just not interested in messing it up. And if you have a look at Iceland, for example, that has developed a lot of geothermal, I think they get 25% of their electricity is from geothermal energy, and probably even more of their total energy use because they can use it for heating as well. It's changed the landscape. You know, it's not impact free. It sounds like it should be because it's all underground, right? But you have to. Right. Yeah, it's a bit like oil or gas exploration. You know, you have to drill and find where's a good place, and so you do some test drills, and then it won't come up exactly where you want to put your power plant. And so, you know, there's pipes and stuff, and just, it is disruptive, and you wouldn't do it in the middle of a, you know, treasured national park. So yeah, it's one of those things where it makes so much sense on the face of it, but when you actually consider, like, geothermal in general makes a lot of sense, but if you start talking about any specific geothermal project, then it makes less sense. So I do think we should be investigating options and new technologies, and especially ones that can, you know, reduce the risk of causing earthquakes or eliminate it. Let's see how these guys go. I hope that they move slowly and with a lot of oversight, because it does seem risky. And in a James Bond kind of way.
Well, if you go to the website like and you look at the... Yeah, exactly. If you go to the website and look at the companies that are associated with it, you go, those are some big names. Yes, it gets James Bondy really quickly. Yeah. What are they all up to? It just seems like one of those things that can go wrong. You know, it has that feeling of, if they were able to do it and somebody wanted to use that technology for harm, they really could. Not to say you couldn't do other things, but that one seems like a super powerful piece of technology. And yeah, you would think you'd be careful about it. Even if, say, they could do it, would we ever hear about it if they actually did it? a couple of weeks ago, Rosemary, just before Thanksgiving, so this is like middle of November, I was out in sort of western New York State looking at a wind turbine that had been damaged by lightning. And I stopped by, and I knew that State University of New York, Oswego, so they call it SUNY Oswego, had done some research about lightning strikes in that area. And the area I'm talking about is right on the edge of Lake Ontario. So anybody in Canada and sort of eastern part of the United States knows where that is. It's sort of north and a little bit east of Buffalo. So they have lightning strikes that come off in the snowstorms off of Lake Ontario onto shore, and they had been tracking them. And the SUNY Oswego researcher, Scott Steiger, who I had an opportunity to sit down with for an hour or so when I was out there, had been researching snow coming off Lake Ontario and the lightning strikes that were happening from those snowstorms. So the snow gets up in there, starts spinning around, creates this friction, creates static electricity. Static electricity turns into lightning. And they had tracked it long enough that a wind farm had been installed during the research period. So they knew where lightning strikes occurred pre-wind turbines and post-wind turbines. And it turns out, once the wind turbines were installed, there were a lot of lightning strikes on the wind turbines. And at the time, they didn't really think much about it, but it turns out that these storms are triggering lightning strikes off the wind turbines. And when I was out a couple of weeks ago, they had a huge snowstorm. In fact, I just missed it. Thank goodness I just missed it. Got out of there just in time. They had about 5 feet of snow over basically a 2-day period. And they had a whole bunch of lightning strikes to wind turbines right off the coast of Lake Ontario again. Now, this time, though, SUNY Oswego and Scott Steiger were ready because they had a Doppler radar and a lightning mapping array, which is sort of a way of actually watching discharges in the sky and then making these little computer images of them. It's pretty cool. So they had all the technology, and they had applied for a grant to go do that from the National Science Foundation. So they had all the technology set up just before that storm came in. So they captured probably one of the best snowstorm/lightning events up in that region, and they had it fully instrumented. So they have a ton of data coming. Now, what we're seeing is what we call upper lightning strikes happen. What we think is upper lightning strikes, which seem to be the big thing. So when Rosemary is out designing de-icing system and blades, lightning strikes are a big deal. And upper lightning strikes, as the blades have got longer, become more of a big deal because some of the physics, the way lightning is working, when you have lightning strikes in random places, they tend to trigger lightning in the clouds. In Australia, do you have that kind of thing happen in the summertime, Rosemary, where you have these lightning events that happen in the clouds only? So you see this kind of discharge roll through miles and miles of clouds. Is that something you have down there too?
Not that I know of, but I don't pay as close attention to lightning as you do, probably. I pay some attention. And I'm definitely interested, but I couldn't say for sure that we don't have that.
So researchers, we had Tom Warner on the podcast not too long ago, and Tom had been doing a lot of research into this area. And what seems to be the little trigger for all these wind turbines creating lightning strikes is there's a random lightning strike from the cloud to the ground. Now there's a discharge in the cloud. So you see this charge connect up via this lightning discharge, a leader, quote unquote leader in the cloud. When that leader happens and that discharge happens in the clouds, all the wind turbines sitting underneath of it see that charge all of a sudden, and they reach out. So you get these, what they call upward lightning strikes. You see these leaders, lightning leaders, which are just basically, they're just charge. They're just a length of charge that reach up into the sky. And then they have lightning strikes on wind turbines. In fact, most of the lightning strikes you see on these taller wind turbines are upward lightning strikes. Somewhere 80, 90% in some cases are these upper lightning strikes. So the question comes about, we don't know a lot about them. And Tom Warner's research group and Marcelo Zaba down in Brazil was involved in a lot of that. They did a lot of research roughly 10 years ago, and it was just before everything kind of got kicked off. And wind turbines weren't that popular in the United States. There were some, but not like there are now, and they aren't the size they are now. Rosemary, you were involved in a lot of lightning testing while working at LM because of de-icing.
Yes, you're triggering painful memories.
See, did you? Yeah, flashbacks. Yeah. So you spent a good bit of time in the lightning lab, right?
I didn't get to. I was occupied in the factory, putting out other fires, so to speak. So I didn't get to. I tried when I was in Boston. I was trying to go to your old lightning lab there in Massachusetts, but I didn't manage that either. So
lightning technologies.
I still haven't managed to get into a lightning lab, but I will keep trying until I get in there. And I want to see it. And I want to make a video on it as well.
Yeah, we have to get you to a lightning lab. And one of the things that we're trying to understand right now, and this is why I think between the two of us, you could probably figure out a lot of this, you being a blade designer and me being a crazy lightning person. There's a lot of lightning physics that we're just learning about or becoming more knowledgeable about because we've never had a rotating tall object like a wind turbine on the Earth like this at these heights.
Yeah.
And we haven't been able to document what's happening lightning-wise until recently either.
Yeah, so that was so frustrating trying to, manage the design of a new system that had strong implications for the lightning protection system. Just the fact that people don't really know. So you can design something that you think will be good, but if it's really new and hasn't been done before, you don't actually know. And so the lightning test labs are great, but they can't 100% replicate what's going out there in the field. I mean, you haven't got a full-size blade rotating. And of course you do it once or twice, you don't get every kind of lightning and every possible attachment point that you might get in reality. But I wanted to ask you something about this recent event where the turbines were instrumented. Does that mean that they definitively showed that it's definitely an upward strike from the turbine? So the turbine is definitely causing the lightning strikes, it's not just that coincidentally there was lightning in the area, even if it seems statistically unlikely that it would so often happen on the wind turbines. They've actually gone further than statistics and just actually showing cause and effect.
Yes.
Right. So that's very interesting because
Scott's
before I got involved with wind turbines and lightning for that, I had no idea that structure can cause lightning. And I always wondered, because they always say, the tallest structure in the area is the one that's going to get struck by lightning. And I just always wondered, how does the lightning know that there is a tall structure down there? Because the lightning starts in a cloud. That's what you understand when you're, learning about it in school. But actually it's the upward lightning that's causing the problems. And I guess weakening it's causing a less resistance in the air upwards. And that's why you get the strike hitting the tall things.
Yeah, you're getting right. The downward lightning strikes are what you mostly see if you're wandering around and there's a storm out. You mostly see downward lightning strikes. That's what you see. And those are random events because I think you're thinking about this correctly. If the lightning originates from the cloud, it kind of wanders around the sky till it finds a place to attach. If it sees a tall building, it may jump over there, but there's still a probability that you, the person, some distance away from the tall building, are getting struck. It's sort of a random event. It's going to find a tall object, but not necessarily. You see it all the time. If you look in Cape Canaveral where they launch rockets, you see lightning strikes that are near the rocket that's sitting on the pad out there. It just doesn't hit it. Well, sometimes it does though, and so it's the probability. With upper lightning strike, that probability kind of goes away, because the lightning event starts from the wind turbine or the rocket or the tall object. And it's just the way the physics are with those particular kind of storms. What we saw with this recent snowstorm off of Lake Ontario, and can I say thank God for Twitter? Because the researchers at Vasala, who do all the lightning detection network in the States, put up a little image of the lightning strikes that happened on the coastline. There was a series of like a dozen wind turbines right along the coastline, and they were showing that those lightning strikes happened where those turbines were during that snowstorm. Yes. So they were able to detect upward lightning and track it. So there is going to be a ton of research. I'm sure Scott and his crew over at SUNY Oswego are probably sort of thumbing through all that data. They're going to have a ton of data. So I can't wait for the research to come out. He told me it's going to take about 6 months before they can start releasing things. So maybe the summer we'll have some data. That would be cool because we need to know more about how lightning is attaching to wind turbines, particularly in the States, because we're going to put a lot of wind turbines up here.
And it's such a big problem. I mean, everywhere I see it a lot in Australia, just, a lot of failures from lightning because blade designs have changed a lot, and the science of lightning strikes is not kept pace with the rate of change of technology development, and people are flying a little bit blind, designing these systems that seem like they should be doing the job, but you just see a lot of failures, and you always end up in fights between insurance companies and asset owners and also manufacturers. It's always a big fight to see who the liability rests with. So it would be good to just get that better under control and just, have it be a reliable thing that works every time, like most other parts of a wind turbine.
Yes. Well, the most difficult job in a wind turbine factory on the design side is de-icing systems, I think, just because the lightning thing isn't well known. And especially when you were there 20 years ago, I don't know, you weren't there that long
I was at university still 20 years ago.
At this point, Rosemary, you're like an old hand at blade design. But you know how difficult that can be, because anytime you want to put something conductive in the blade, everybody screams foul and says, oh, the lightning's going to take it out. And it probably will.
They say you may not put anything conductive in the blade. That's the normal way that's done, because you don't know what's going to happen. And you won't know until you've got, hundreds of them out there, and you've got enough events that you can do some statistics on it. It's very challenging, and it's not like other systems. The rest of it's one of the most important parts of the product that I was designing. But the main part, the de-icing part, the part that heats the blade up, you put that out there and then you test it. And, a few times I was unlucky where the test year might have been like really warm, so there weren't many good icing events, but at least you can, turn it on and see if it gets warm, and you're going to get something. But that turbine is highly unlikely to get struck by lightning in that year. And certainly, even if it did get struck by lightning once, that wouldn't be enough to, tell you if this was a problem or not, because you don't know where it's going to attach. And so you have to put them out there before you really know if you've got a good protection system in place. And that's just a real challenge, that you might have hundreds, thousands of blades out there before you start to get enough data to, realize, oh, this doesn't behave the way that we expected. And it doesn't matter how many, times you test in a lab, or, how carefully you follow the standards, the design standards when you're making it. It's just lightning is, the technology has moved far away from the science of lightning. And so, it's just challenging.
Yeah, it has. You're absolutely right. It's one of the most challenging aspects in blade design today. And the physics that we did know 20 years ago, and we're starting to apply them to wind turbines, don't really apply as well as we thought that they did. And there's a lot about aerodynamics. There's a lot about the way the lightning is occurring. There's a lot about the lightning protection systems that don't play well together. Yeah. And we're working really hard to fix that, because, Rosemary, you're right. If we have to put 1,000 blades out in service to figure out it doesn't work, it's really too late.
But that's where we're at now. I mean, there's heaps of everyone in the industry knows that there are certain blades or certain manufacturers that are seeing way more failures than you should expect with their lightning protection system. And, from manufacturers that in the past they had very reliable systems in place. So it's not just that they, don't know what they're doing or they don't care. It's that, things are different now with these new types of blade structures with carbon fiber and with really long blades. And It's it keeps people like us busy though, doesn't it?
And they're moving at 200 miles an hour. Oh yeah, it keeps us super busy. It really does.
Yeah, serial defects are my favorite.
Send all your serial lightning defects to care of Rosemary.
Yeah, exactly.
Portaloo, Australia. That's all you need. You put it in an envelope, it'll get to her. So don't worry.
Get the latest on wind industry news, business, and technology sent straight to you every week. Sign up for the Uptime Tech newsletter at weatherguardwind.com/news.
We have Phil Totaro back from Intelstor. Check him out at intelstor.com. And we're going to be talking about PPAs and how products are designed to fit those PPAs. Phil, would you like to just describe some of the data you've unsurfaced?
Sure. Thanks, Alan. What's interesting is we've been going through a cataloging process based on recently published data from FERC and Berkeley National Labs in the United States. And they published a list of power purchase contracts, about 525 of them, for utility scale wind projects. There's about 1,300 wind farms in the U.S., so this doesn't cover all of them. And obviously, we know that there's some corporate power offtake mixed in there these days. But the one thing that we noticed, just by kind of visual inspection of the trend, is that PPAs have been getting cheaper. And in some cases, they've been getting so cheap that they're below not just $20 a megawatt hour. Some of them have been below $10 a megawatt hour, if you can believe it.
Wow.
So that kind of begs a question. Considering the fact that, based on previous research we've done and published about kind of asset lifespan and the fact that in the United States, you've got like about a 10-year life cycle for a wind turbine before it falls off in performance. Some of these projects that have a PPA below $20 a megawatt hour are not going to see a net positive return on capital on the project during the typical 20-year lifespan of a conventional project. Some projects are even seeing a 25-year PPA get executed, a 30-year PPA get executed. And for some of these projects that are, like $10, $11, $12 a megawatt hour, we did the math, and you literally have to have a 50-year asset life, and you literally would have to repower your project 3 or 4 times during that asset life to requalify for the PTC in order to have that project turn a profit. That's also making the assumption that you're going to stay at a $10 or $11 PPA, which is probably not going to be the case. But that brings up a whole lot of questions about the way assets are designed, implemented, and operated.
Sure. If you're operating at that low of a PPA, and hopefully you're getting production tax credits on top of that, because it seems like your margins are really slim. I'll give you the numbers from Massachusetts recently. Offshore wind with Commonwealth Wind had a PPA at about $75 a megawatt hour. So anything below 10 seems incredibly low. Is that driven at all by the co-op nature of some of these energy systems? Like I know Nebraska's that way. I think Oklahoma can be that way. Is it a co-op situation, or is it just independent power producers that are trying to feed the grid and just have a different model for generating revenue?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So you brought up a great point. The co-ops have been signing some of the, on the cheaper side, not necessarily down at the like $10 or $11 level. However, the other situation that the industry is facing right now is you see a huge queue of interconnection requests at all the regional ISOs, or pretty much all the regional ISOs in the United States.
Yeah.
So what some independent power producers for wind energy are doing is they're getting a power purchase contract executed with what's called a community choice aggregator, or some kind of power marketing company that's basically going to agree to buy the power and then resell it to consumers at a modest markup off of whatever the PPA is. So there's a couple of projects, and I'll just give you some numbers. Skeleton Creek in Oklahoma, which I believe is a NextEra project. It's a 250 megawatt project, $9.94 PPA. Crossing Trails in Colorado, EDPR project for 104 megawatts, $9.62 PPA. And then the Mojave County wind farm in Arizona, just under 300 megawatts. I forget who owns that one, but it's $8.64. $8.64. $8.64 is absolutely dirt cheap. You're talking about getting into a price range now of hydropower where they've got, they might sign a 30-year PPA at $5 or $6 a megawatt hour, but they've got a 70-year asset life. And they know that they're going to have to refurbish some of the components during that time frame. But if you've got, imagine that you did have an $8.64 a megawatt hour PPA for wind energy, you are necessarily, again, even with the PTC, you're only getting that benefit for the first 10 years, of course. What the Inflation Reduction Act does now is it gives you the opportunity to, replenish or repower or at least reblade or renacelle in your project after 10 years and requalify for a brand new PTC. But in this case, with PPAs being so cheap, you're not just doing a 40-year design life or a 50-year design life out of necessity because of the improvements in the reliability of the product. You're doing it because you're never going to see a net positive return on capital if you don't have an asset life that long, and if you don't repower your project 2, 3, 4 times during its asset life.
Right. Phil, this has been great to touch base on this. I know we're going to have you back because there's just so many moving pieces to the financial market in wind energy. So Phil, thanks for coming back. Everybody, check out Phil Totaro and Intelstor, INTELSTOR.com, and where you'll learn about wind energy and where it's headed.
Thanks, Alan.
That's going to do it for this week's Uptime Wind Energy Podcast. We missed you, Joel. Come back soon. Thanks for listening. Please take a moment and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. And be sure to subscribe in the show notes below to Uptime Tech News, our weekly newsletter, as well as Rosemary's YouTube channel, Engineering with Rosie. And we'll see you here next week on the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast. Miss you, Joel.